Now let's turn our attention to implementing security at the database level. We've already talked about a little earlier in the course how a login account allows a user to connect to the SQL server. And so we create these SQL Server login accounts. They can be mapped to Windows user accounts or Windows user group membership, but this allows the user to connect to the SQL Server. However, accessing a particular database is going to require some sort of database user account. Since SQL Server 2012, this has become a little bit more complicated. It gives you a lot more control, and it allows us to implement kind of a different way of managing the SQL Server databases, and that is something called partially contained databases. And we'll talk about those later on in the course. But for now, you can see how this is implemented. If you go out into the SQL Server Management Studio, you'll notice this is our SQL Server level. And if we'll look at the SQL Server level, there is a security folder, and within that, there are the logins. And these are those user accounts that can connect to the SQL Server. But once they're on the SQL Server, which can have multiple databases, we now have to either map users or create users for every individual database. Now notice, every database, including our sample database, AdventureWorks 2012, has a security folder. And in that security folder is users for that particular database. So every database is going to have its own security folder. Now, a user is going to have a database user account of some kind in each database on a SQL server that they need to access. There's a terminology alert here. Make sure you pick up on the little nuances that I've been using as I've described SQL Server login accounts and database connection or user accounts. When you hear the term in SQL Server login, that is referring to an account that's used to gain access at the SQL Server level. So a SQL Server login allows you to connect to the SQL Server box. A user account or a user refers to an account that's used to gain access to a specific database on the SQL Server. All right, there's two levels of authentication here. We first have to be able to connect to the SQL Server. We then have to be able to connect to a specific database. Now, there are two types of database user accounts. These are accounts that are based on logins at the server level. This is where we create a login at the server level, and then we just kind of map that login into a particular database. Now, what's unique about these kinds of logins that are created and maintained at the server level is that the Windows accounts that we map into SQL Server in a trusted connection, even the SQL Server logins that we create out there at that server level, are stored in the master database out there on SQL Server. Again, we're at that server level. These kinds of accounts used to be the standard. It used to be the only option you had. But now these accounts are not the only option we have, and these really are used most often for users who need to access multiple databases on the server. Then there's the second main type of database user account, and it is what has become to be known as a contained database user. This is a user account that's not associated with a master database login. And we'll get into the implications of this in a lot more detail as we move through the course. As it turns out, when we get to the database level and we start to deal with user accounts, there's many different user account types that we can choose from when we create a database user. And this has to do with the more options that are available now in SQL Server. And this all kind of started back in SQL Server 2012. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a lot more detail later on in the course. Database security can be managed two ways. We can work with database security using the graphical tools in SQL Server Management Studio, and we can use transact SQL statements. We can create users and alter users and all this sort of thing. We'll take a look at that again later on, but you can take a look in the working files folder for this chapter, and I've put some documentation out there for you, and it's called Create User Transact SQL. It's a PDF file. It will give you some examples and the syntax and explain some of these user account options that we have at the database level. Okay, so you might want to print that out, take a look at it. But for now, let's open SQL Server Management Studio and take a look. So I'm going to jump out into the Management Studio. Notice at the server level, we have a security folder, and I have my particular username mapped into here, right? This is a trusted connection, and it's based on me signing in with a Windows account called Mark Long. Then at the individual database level, AdventureWorks 2012, there's also a security folder. Since I'm part of the sysadmin, I automatically have access here, but notice I can right click on the security folder and choose new and then user. Now I want you to notice something here, and this has gotten a little more complex since SQL Server 2012. Notice the user type, a SQL user with a login. This is a user that has a login that was created or mapped in at the SQL Server level. I can choose my username, then I can choose the login name. So notice these can be different if I want them to be. And then there's the default schema that I want to use. But notice in this drop down, I want you to pay close attention here. I can choose SQL user without a login. And notice my options that I can fill in down here change. We'll talk more about this particular type later on in the course. Then there's user map to a certificate, user map to an asymmetric key, and then just plain old Windows user. But again, I want you to notice how the interface is changing here to accept different pieces of information. But this is how we would go about creating a user account for our database. And again, we no longer have to depend on the server level logins that are created in the security folder for the server. This can get a little bit confusing, especially if you're new, but we're going to talk about this in a little more detail as we move through the course, and it'll start to make a little more sense.